Some of you may find today's parable in Luke's gospel troubling, and others may find it a source of comfort. It all depends on your perspective and how you see and interpret Jesus' words in today's gospel text. It is clearly a parable. We know that. It is not something that Jesus has witnessed firsthand, but just because it's a parable, a didactic teaching tool, doesn't mean that we should not take this parable to heart. We should take Jesus' words in today's parable very seriously. Just a little bit of background. Keep in mind that since the 9th chapter, actually 9:51, in Luke's gospel, when Jesus turns his face toward Jerusalem, we know that from that moment forward, Jesus makes a series of stops in various towns and communities and hamlets. And along the way, he's doing a bit of didactic teaching, talking about the kingdom of God and the economy of God's kingdom. And in the various times in which he stops and he teaches, there's a mixture of folk present listening to him. Sometimes it's just his disciples. Other times it's the disciples and people of the community. And then there are those times like now when it's his disciples, some folk from the local community, and the Pharisees. And so I would dare say that Jesus' parable today is probably the most challenging and the one that pushes in on sensibilities of the Pharisees as it does to us and for us today. Jesus stops and he says, "There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores." Jesus begins his parable by making a stark contrast between the rich man and Lazarus. Jesus says actually very little about the rich man. What we know is that the man lived extravagantly. We are told that his outer garments and his coat were made of purple, which means that it was very expensive because the purple was extracted from a sea snail, and the secretion was used to make the fabric. And we are also told that the undergarments of the rich man were made of fine Egyptian linen. We are told that the rich man dined sumptuously, lived extravagantly, with no care or concern toward Lazarus. And then we are told in the gospel text that there was a poor man named Lazarus who laid at the gate of the rich man's house. It is worth noting that in the Greek, the word balo is used. And so the NRSV translation, which you have before you, sort of lightens the idea of how Lazarus arrived at the gate of the rich man's house. The text says that Lazarus laid at the gate of the rich man's house, but the Greek, in the original Greek, is balo, and what that means is that Lazarus was thrown at the gate of the rich man's house. That perhaps there were people in the community who saw Lazarus as an unsightly figure, and knowing the materials that the rich man possessed, thinking, if we just throw Lazarus at the gate of the rich man's home, he will take care of him. And so even in the Greek, Jesus is trying hard to get us to understand the difference between the rich man and Lazarus. And even if we think about what's happening in our own country right now, it's not hard to imagine the poor and the dispossessed and the marginalized being tossed and thrown someplace. But Lazarus was tossed, thrown at the gate of the rich man's house. To add further insult, Jesus says that Lazarus sat at the gate, wanting, craving the bread that fell from the rich man's table. Even this piece of the parable deserves a bit of unpacking. It is not simply that the Lazarus is craving the crumbs or the bread that falls from the rich man's table, but in antiquity, bread was used, the soft part of the bread was used as a napkin. And so when you were done eating, you would take the bread and you would wash your hands in water. And then you would throw the bread under the table. And so you would either wipe your mouth, wash your hands, and then throw the bread under the table. That's the bread that Lazarus craved to eat. That's how destitute Lazarus became. If you are at Grace Church during Ash Wednesday, you have probably seen the altar guild set up a bowl of lemon, water, and bread. And after the clergy complete the imposition of ashes, and we have all the ashes on the tips of our fingers, we each take time to take bread, dip it in lemon and water, and scrub. That's how we get the ashes out of our hands. And so you can imagine that this is an old practice, that we use bread to get the ashes out of the fingertips. And so here, the rich man and those like him used bread to wipe their hands and around their mouths. And then they would toss it on the floor. And to go a step further, we are told that even stray dogs, unclean stray dogs, would come and lick Lazarus' sores. In all likelihood, Jesus did not see these events, but it is reasonable, it's plausible that Jesus knows or knew someone like this, which is why we should take Jesus' parable to heart. And so the parable goes on to say that at some point, the rich man, whom we don't know by name, and Lazarus, whom we do know by name. So if you notice the inversion of the economy of God's kingdom, the irony to the story, even before Lazarus and the rich man dies, is that while the rich man has material wealth and possession and reputation, it is Lazarus who has identity. Because Jesus doesn't even bother to tell us the name of the rich man, but he makes a point to tell us the name of the poorest of the poor in that community. We know Lazarus. We know him because he has a name. And all of us at Grace Church, we know how important our names are. Our names tell us a great deal, tell others a great deal about us. The first thing we say to folks is, who are you? I think I know your parents. I think I went to school with your grandparents. Tell me your last name again. There is something about our names. We name our children after our parents and grandparents and our grandmothers and grandfathers simply because we want to keep the name going. We want to keep the lineage going. There is power in knowing someone's name. But why doesn't Jesus give the rich man a name? Some scholars suggest that the reason Jesus doesn't give the rich man a name is because the rich man's name wasn't written in the book of heaven, but Lazarus' was. That because of the rich man's unwillingness to use his fortune to make Lazarus' life a little better. His name was excluded from the book of heaven. And so for Jesus, what he's saying in this parable is, it's not even important that you know who the rich man is. You just have to be on guard and not live the way the rich man lived. While you are able, try to close the chasm, the gap that separates the rich from the poor. To be clear, Jesus does not condemn the rich man for having money and wealth and power and prestige. Not once does Jesus ever condemn him for being rich. But he does condemn him for not assisting and not making better the life of his brother Lazarus, who sat at the gate craving just the bread that fell from the table of the rich man's home. So already, Jesus has stripped the rich man of true power and true identity. I don't think there's nothing more insulting than not knowing someone's name, especially if they are people of power. After all, we know names like Winfrey and Bezos and Trump. We know those names. Those names, they evoke some type of reaction, some type of response. Our culture, even today, we identify people by their names. But seldom are we told the names of those who are on the streets and the subways of New York City, who are trying to just eke out a decent living as human beings. Truth be told, I'm not sure we even care to know their names. Many times we don't even want to see them, and we pretend like we don't see them. We don't want them to say anything to us. We don't want them to ask anything of us. We want to just go from point A to point B. And that's Jesus' whole message. Is while we have the opportunity to close the gap, the chasm that Luke speaks about, we too may have a similar experience as the rich man once his life ends. So this parable is the parable of reversals. It's how the rich man lived this fabulous life during his earthly life, and Lazarus was unfortunate, had an unfortunate life, and didn't have much, and didn't own much. But then look at what Jesus does when they both die. The text says, and both of them died. And we have to assume that the rich man, because of his power and prestige and wealth, and the community knew him personally, that he probably had a grand homegoing service. I suspect that a lot of people came out to pay tribute to him, and they reminisced about him and perhaps the lavish parties that he threw while he was with them. And yet, after this grand funeral and this grand homegoing service for this wealthy man, he ends up in hell. Those are Jesus' words, by the way, not mine. He ends up in hell. After all the tribute, instead of paying tribute to him to say, you know, he cared for the least of these. He modeled for us what it means to be a child of Abraham. He helped us to see that it's not just about accumulating wealth and possessions, but that we are to share what we have with others. No one said that. No one spoke those words over the rich man. And after all of that, he ends up in hell. But then Jesus says, Lazarus dies. And Lazarus is taken to the bosom of Abraham. Actually, the original Greek, which I actually find interesting, it doesn't say that Lazarus went to the bosom of Abraham. It says that he actually laid on Abraham's lap, as if to suggest, thank God I'm at rest. The original Greek says Abraham's lap, but lap or bosom, regardless of the text. I think what Jesus is saying is now Lazarus is in a place of rest and comfort. And he is away, far away with Abraham, and the rich man looks up. Remember, it was always Lazarus in the former life looking up. Now the rich man has to look up, and he sees Lazarus with Abraham And in his torment, in the flames, in his torment, in his suffering, the rich man says to Abraham, Father Abraham, send Lazarus so that he might dip his finger in water and cool my thirst. Give me thirst. Ease my pain and suffering. Think about this, Grace Church, that even in hell, the rich man still believes he's in charge. He still has the audacity to demand something of Lazarus. Even in death, while he's in hell, he's saying, Father Abraham, you know who I am. Send Lazarus, put him to work, and let him serve me. Mind you, the rich man wants Lazarus to do for him what he never did for Lazarus during his earthly life. And Abraham says to him, you know, when you had your life, you lived sumptuously and did not care for your brother or your sister. And now that you are here, there is nothing I can do for you. Abraham reminds the rich man that there is a chasm. There is a gulf between them, between Abraham and Lazarus and the rich man. And what should give us a moment of pause is that Abraham says that even God, in God's self, cannot cross the chasm. Remember, Abraham says the chasm is so great between us that if I wanted to send Lazarus to aid you, he couldn't. Think about that. That what Jesus is saying is because of the choices the rich man made in his earthly life, he is now condemned eternally to a life of suffering, and that life of suffering is eternal. Abraham says there is no way ever, ever, ever you will be able to be with us or us with you. My God. You know, one of the things we love about God as Christians is that there's always the possibility of mending our lives and getting closer to God. But Jesus seemed to be suggesting in his parable, but you need to do that while you have the time. The time will come when it's too late, and once the chasm, which is fixed, you find yourself on the other side, there is no redemption. That's what Jesus is saying. It's not my parable, it's Jesus' parable. And so the rich man, he doesn't stop there. It's interesting because Luke's gospel could have ended right there. I mean, Luke, Abraham says, there is no way we can get to you and you to us. And you would think, and I would think, the rich man would say, okay, well, it's done. But the rich man, in his persistence, says to Father Abraham, well, okay, since you can't send Lazarus to me, would you send him to my 5 brothers and warn them not to come to this place? And you and I would think that Abraham would say, okay, that's a fair request. I'll send Lazarus back to warn your brothers. But notice what Abraham says to the rich man. He denies his request. And he says, your brothers, like everyone else, know the Bible. You don't need anyone from the dead telling you how to live a godly life. Your brothers know. They have Moses, they have the prophets. And Grace Church, we have the Gospels in addition to Moses and the prophets. And so none of us at Grace Church this morning, I could be wrong, I doubt it, none of us need anyone to come back from the dead to tell us how to live a godly and good life. Abraham says, your brothers have everything they need to do God's will. Either you do it, they do it, or you don't. And Abraham says, and not only that, your brothers' hearts are so hardened that even if someone came back from the dead, they still wouldn't change their ways. because they have become jaundiced-eyed because of their wealth and their power and the prestige. Abraham is saying, if the Bible can't change their hearts, then nothing will do it. And so the parable this morning is Jesus is saying to us, we have a commitment and an obligation as Christians and followers of Jesus Christ to do our very best to close the chasm that exists in our community, in our city, and beyond as best we are able. We may not be able to close the chasm for everyone, every homeless, every poor person in Brooklyn, every person who is hungry. We may not be able to touch every soul and change every life, but Jesus is saying, but you must do your part to close the chasm because God is watching. And it's so easy in our culture to get caught up in material wealth and party living that we forget about the least of these until it's too late. Grace Church, take Jesus' parable to heart. He's not trying to invoke fear. He's trying to tell us this is the way God judges the human heart. Luckily, at Grace Church, as a community, we are doing our very best to try to close that gap in our own way. We have the shelter coming up, and we have parishioners and clergy who are working to make sure that we do our bit, our part, to trying to keeping dignity, instilling dignity in people who find themselves in very difficult and tough times. We continue to work in Red Hook, at the Red Hook Farm. While we may not be hungry, we know that food insecurity is a real issue for the least of these, and we have people in this parish who go out every month working side by side so that we make no distinction. We close the gap. We're trying to close the chasm. We have parishioners in this church who are extremely generous when it comes to meeting the needs of the least, the lost, and the left out, and the forgotten. And so we are doing it. But that can't be said of all places and of all people. But remember, you and I as individuals must also do our part away from Grace Church. Because God is watching. And Jesus' parable, as he makes his way toward Jerusalem to face his own death, Jesus is trying to get the people of his day and us to understand what is most important to God. Because this very temporary and relatively short life we have in the world is pale in comparison to the life to come. And what Jesus is really asking, the question that you and I must wrestle with, is it worth the gamble? I'm not willing to gamble to find out if there's everlasting torment. Jesus said, there is. I take Jesus at his word. But what Jesus is asking us to do is not impossible. It's the right thing. It's the good thing. It's the godly thing. How many Lazaruses have been tossed at your gate and my gate, and we just walk past them? Every day we walk past them. And I am convinced that God sometimes put Lazaruses in our community to help us to get it right while we have time. Grace Church, I want God to know you by name. I don't want the kingdom of heaven to say there was a rich woman and a rich man. I want each and every one of your names written in the book of heaven. And I want you and I, at the appropriate time, to hear the words of Jesus. Well done, good and faithful servant. Now come and take your rest. That's the gift of the kingdom. Let us work and do our part to close the chasm that exists. Let us be mindful and attentive to the poor, the least, the lost, and the left out, so that all glory can be given to God. Amen.